I'm Mike Dunbar. I've been a woodworking teacher for 21 years. Before my wife and I founded the Windsor Institute here in Hampton, New Hampshire, I was an itinerant. I traveled from city to city teaching woodworking classes. I've taught thousands of people to work wood, and they've taught me something, and that is that most of them did not know how to sharpen. That was a problem because they would show up for class with tools that weren't ready to use. I had a further problem in that many of the places I taught had inadequate sharpening facilities. So I developed this system that I'm going to show you. It's a sandpaper on glass sharpening system that we call around here Easy Sharp.
We call our system Easy Sharp for a reason, and that's because it's so easy to learn and do. Among its many advantages, there's no need to grind. That means you'll never again burn a tool. Our grinder and buffer haven't been used in so long, they're covered with dust. A quick definition of a sharp edge for a woodworker is two flat, polished surfaces meeting at an angle that will cut wood. Let's call it the sharpening angle. Don't get all wrapped up in how many degrees. It's all just an approximation. To make sure the surfaces of that edge are flat, you need the polishing abrasive on something flat to start with. We use glass. It's cheap and easy to get. 3/8 inch is a good thickness. Less than that and it's likely to crack. You could also use a plate of aluminum, your table saw, or a joiner bed. To polish the flat edge surface, we use aluminum oxide pressure-sensitive adhesive paper that you can get from any of the suppliers listed at the end of the show. It's sold by the initials PSA, and it comes in rolls like these. You'll need a roll of 80, 120, and 320 grit. Although the rolls cost between $15 and $20 each, they're a tremendous bargain. They'll last a small shop many years. Cut a strip about 12 to 14 inches long with a utility knife. Peel off the protective back and adhere the paper to the glass. Don't worry if all the corners don't hold down. They will after you actually do some sharpening. Do the same with the other two grits. It's best to have a dedicated station like we have here at the Institute. If you have to dig around and go through a lot of setup for your sharpening equipment, and then clean it all up afterwards before you can use one of your machines, you won't sharpen as frequently as you should. Working with dull tools is a lot more work, gives worse results, and it's more dangerous. So you can see better, I'll take the glass over to a workbench and hold it between dogs. You need two other accessories, a stiff bristle brush for cleaning the paper, and a single-edged razor to take the paper off the glass when it needs replacing. Now all we need are some tools to sharpen. We keep our school tools here on the wall. They're all painted with an ugly fluorescent green paint. That ensures that they don't get accidentally packed with our students' tools when they leave. Here's a jack plane that could stand a little attention. And so could this chisel. Look at that nick in the cutting edge. I'll have that out of there in no time. We'll also sharpen some new tools. New tools are usually ground properly, but not sharp enough to cut wood cleanly and easily. Let me show you why. New tools are usually very coarsely ground at the factory. Let's compare the new chisel to one that's been sharpened before. Notice the heavy scratches on the new one and how much smoother, even polished, the surface of the older one is. You can see the scratches on the cutting edge and on the back as well. Where the two surfaces meet, they produce a very rough edge that won't cut well. Let me sketch what you're seeing. Here's the back of that chisel. These lines are the coarse scratches made by the surface grinding. They run right out to the cutting edge. Under magnification, if you look directly at the cutting edge, where each scratch runs out, it makes a dip that creates this scalloped effect. That's what you were seeing on the new chisel. When you looked at the older chisel that we'd already sharpened, you saw a straight line. Let me show you what happens when you try to use a new chisel. See? No real shavings. Just a lot of crumbled wood. So, let's get to work on the sandpaper with the new chisel. We'll start on the 80 grit. Start on the back. You need to be careful to create even pressure on the chisel. I use 2 fingers, one on each corner. Second, you need to be sure to keep the chisel flat. Don't rock the handle back, or above all, up. You can see the damage that would do to the cutting edge. Notice my body position. Keeping the chisel flat with even pressure is easier if you're leaning over the tool. So, your shoulder should be above it. Sharpening is a process of flattening and then replacing rough scratches with increasingly finer scratches. Look what those few passes have done. The scratches from the surface grinding are all gone. They've been replaced by a mat of finer scratches from the 80 grit paper. I can see that the back surface has a slight hollow in it. It's common with new tools. Until you've done enough sharpening this way to see the details easily, here's a trick that might help. Use a red marker and cover the back. A few more passes and the hollow area is clearly visible. The hollow isn't a problem though, unless it touches the cutting edge. This one doesn't. Still, only a little more lapping gets rid of the hollow altogether. It isn't necessary to start with 80 grit every time you sharpen. It's just the paper we use for flattening large surfaces and removing blemishes like surface grinding, rust pitting, and nicks. For tools that are in pretty good shape that just need honing, I'll start with the 320 grit. That does it for the 80 grit. Before moving on to the 120, I use the brush to sweep the paper clean. You don't want any loose grit from a coarser paper getting between the tool and the finer paper. It's an important habit to develop. Now, repeat the process on the 120 grit. Be sure to keep an even pressure and don't lift that handle. See how the finer scratches have replaced the coarser ones? Clean the paper again with the brush. And we're on to the 320 grit, doing the same thing as before. Look at what we've done. The scratches are getting much finer. The sloping edge has been surface ground as well, but the area is so much smaller than the back, we can start on the 320 grit. You know all those gadgets you see for holding a chisel at the right angle for honing? You don't need one if you do it this way. Place the edge on its heel and lift the handle until you feel the cutting edge come into contact. It's such a definite sensation that you can't miss it. Now you're at the proper angle. It's easy to keep the angle because you're going to go side to side. Take a look at my fingers and you can see how I do it. Be sure to keep the pressure even. See how little of the original surface grinding remains. This time, they're all gone. As fine as the scratches are from the 320 grit, they're still too coarse. We need a paper that's even finer. This is 600 grit wet and dry paper that I bought at an automobile supply store. Some hardware stores will carry it as well. It comes in sheets. Cut it into thirds. Make sure to sweep. The wet and dry paper doesn't have an adhesive back. Not a problem. We put it on the 320 and there's enough friction to hold it in place. Same thing, even pressure, and don't lift the handle. Look at the results. Those scratches are really fine. Turn it over and do the same. Check the results. We move on to an even finer wet and dry paper. This time, 1000 grit. This paper is so fine it's almost soapy. Notice it doesn't make any scratching sound like the other papers did. And look at the result. The polish is so fine it's like a mirror. In fact, you can see my face reflecting in it. Now the sloping edge. Finally, I use some 1500 grit. Look at that polish. Let's try this edge on the pine end grain. It cuts a chip that holds together. Let's see if I can get it to roll over. See? You can even see the annual rings. Now, that chisel with the nick in the cutting edge. Let's take care of it next. It has another problem too. The edges become worn and dull. Let me draw that for you on the board. Here's our cutting tip. Drawing's never been my strong point. The edge starts out nice and sharp. But as we use it, friction begins to round it over. Now it's time to sharpen it again. By honing the bezel, spelled B-E-Z-E-L, it's a more specific word than bevel, B-E-V-E-L, for the sloping edge on a cutting tool. You take off a small amount of metal and lose some of the rounding. But the edge will still be rounded over up here. You need to flatten the back surface as well. The rounded over effect really shows up on this close-up. See how it's rounded over? Looking straight on, a dull edge can be seen, while a sharp one cannot. To get that edge to disappear on the chisel, we'll get to work on the sandpaper. Taking a lot of metal off with a coarse grit causes a lot of heat. That's why your grinding wheel keeps burning your tools. There's lots of heat here as well. But the great thing about Easy Sharp is you can't burn the tool. Long before you have to worry about drawing the tool's temper, you can't hold on to it. So, I'll have to stop periodically and blow on the chisel to cool it off. The nick is still there, but it's a lot smaller. There. That took care of it. You see how fast that 80 grit is? That didn't take long at all. Now we'll do the same thing we did with the new chisel. We'll hone it through the series of increasingly finer papers. Remember to do both, the bezel and the back flat surface, in order to get rid of the rounded cutting edge. All right, let's get back to that plane blade. The plane is about 70 years old, and at some time was probably left in a barn or a cellar. That caused the blade to rust, and there's some pitting. The pits aren't a problem unless they intersect the cutting edge. Then they cause a nick like the one in the chisel. I'll start the back on the 80 grit.
It's getting hot.
That got rid of any of the pits along the edge where it counts. Those that are back further will disappear with future sharpenings. By now, you know the drill. But I'm going to do something different. This is a jack plane used for heavy work. That means its cutting edge is crested rather than straight across. So, I have to allow for that. I start by establishing my sharpening angle. I place the heel on the paper and lift the back until the cutting edge makes contact. I'm still going side to side, but here's the twist. Instead of making a straight line, as I did with the chisel, I'm going to use an arc. I start with one corner of the blade held down by my finger. As I move the edge along the paper, I make an arc and slowly rock the cutting edge. By the middle of the pass, I'm at the middle of the edge. By the end of the pass, I've completely shifted the weight to my other finger. And I end the stroke with the far corner now in contact with the paper. Repeat that as many times as necessary. You can see from the dark areas on the corners that I have a bit more work. Now, let's use Easy Sharp on a brand new blade. Do all the heavy work on the 80 grit paper. It has the heavy scratches from the surface grinding. You know what I'm doing. I start the back of the blade on the 80 grit, and I move through the finer papers. Notice the reflection of the 320 grit is more of a shadow than the clear mirror polish we'll get later on. Now, the bezel on the 320 grit. Remember, even pressure, directly down. Don't lift the back of the blade. We move on through the wet and dry papers. 600, 1,000, 1,500 grits. Now, that's a polish. You can even see the swirls of my fingerprint in the reflection. If you want the ultimate edge on a tool, try stropping it. I use this 10,000 grit chromium oxide compound on a leather strop. Notice how I pull the blade toward me to avoid cutting the leather. The slices in the one we're using were made by students who didn't know this trick. Just as all cutting edges aren't straight, they're not all flat either. The cutting edge on this carving gouge is curved in an arc. It's known as a sweep. This is a number 3 sweep, 35 millimeter. The lower the number, the more shallow the sweep. The 35 millimeter is a measure of its width. Gouges are very easy to sharpen with Easy Sharp. Start as you did with the chisel by finding the sharpening angle. Set the heel on the paper and raise the handle until you feel the cutting edge come into contact. Hold one corner down with your finger and start a stroke across the paper. Roll the tool by gradually shifting your weight to the other corner. This is the same action we use to sharpen the crested jack plane blade. Only on that tool, we made an arc on the paper. With the gouge, we make a straight line. The exception would be a turning gouge, which has a curve like a fingernail. You would make an arc with that. Now, we have to flatten the gouge's back. We can't do that on the glass because the gouge's blade isn't flat. The trick is to adhere a strip of paper to a short length of dowel, maybe 6 inches long. Just run the dowel back and forth. Of course, you have to keep the dowel flat on the back. If you lower the end of the dowel, you'll roll the edge and ruin it. To finish sharpening a gouge, take it through all the papers. We'll skip the finer ones because you know how to do that. Now, a little technical stuff. Just as bezel is a more specific word than bevel, so is cannel. The cannel is the bezel on a gouge. Most gouges have the cannel on the outside, like the one we just sharpened, and are called out cannel. Others, like this one, have the cannel on the inside and are called in cannel. An in cannel gouge is just as easy to sharpen with this system as any other tool. Start by flattening the back surface to get rid of any rounding of the edge caused by wear, pits, or nicks. Hold the back flat. You don't want to roll the edge. Go through the various grits. To hone the in cannel, adhere a strip of appropriate grit paper to a dowel of an appropriate diameter. Find the sharpening angle by placing the dowel on the heel and lowering, this time, the end until the cutting edge comes into contact. Draw the dowel back and forth, maintaining this angle. Notice I'm using a short stroke and moving across the cannel. Here's another special case. This is a spoke-shave blade. It has a chisel edge, but those two tangs won't let you hone the bezel on the glass. As usual, we start by flattening and polishing the back on the various grit papers. This time, I'll use a flat piece of wood rather than a dowel. Use a piece about the size of a tongue depressor and 2 to 3 times as thick. You want it stiff. Find the proper angle by placing the paper on the bezel's heel and lowering the far end. Now, slide it back and forth. Work through the grits. When you get to the wet and dry papers, they don't have an adhesive back. Stick them to the wood with a spray adhesive you can buy at any hardware or art supply store. The tools we sharpened so far have each had the standard chisel edge, but there are a couple of others you may run into. One is the hollow ground. The bezel is merely arced slightly. The arc comes from sharpening it on a wheel. Sharpen it just like you've been doing the others. The hollow ground edge is even a little easier to hone because you only have to flatten a small surface on the cutting edge and on the heel. Another type of edge is found on a scorp. We use a scorp for hollowing chair seats. This tool has a knife edge rather than a chisel edge. It has the same section as my pocket knife. The back edge is thicker and both sides taper in. It doesn't look like the chisel edge until you look at it in extreme close-up. Then, it's just about the same as the V produced on a chisel edge, only smaller. To work the outside, or convex curve, I've adhered some paper to a small block of hardwood about 2 by 6 inches. Notice that I have a finer grit on the other side of the block. If you're using more than 2 grits, you may need more than 1 block. Because the scorp's blade tapers like a knife, you can't find the proper angle by placing the block on the heel and lifting, as I did on the chisel edge. Instead, work over about a 1/2 inch of blade. As you hone an area, slowly lift the back of the block until you hone right out to the cutting edge. Do this over the entire length of the blade. Do the same with the finer grits. Now the hollow, or concave surface. I'll use another dowel with a diameter appropriate to the job. I'll do the same thing on this surface. I'll hone about a 1/2 inch of the blade. As I work back and forth, I'll also raise the dowel's far end so that I hone right up to the cutting edge. I still pay a service to sharpen my joiner and planer knives and router bits. But let's say you're on a job site and you just need to get a little more time out of a tool. Easy Sharp will buy you that time. Here's a jointer knife with a chisel edge. I'll start by flattening the back. Hone the bezel just like the knife was a long chisel. You know how to find the sharpening angle. For this router bit, I use some paper stuck to one of my strips of hardwood. Remember, 2 surfaces. Same thing on this one. This tool is called a gutter adze. It too has a knife edge. Watch. You'll know just what I'm doing. Sandpaper on a block and on a dowel. Just a couple of final thoughts. There are still plenty of types of tools we haven't shown, ranging from axes to lawnmower blades, that you can sharpen with the Easy Sharp method. But now, you know enough to figure those out on your own.